I'm not sure what actually date this recorded lecture is supposed to be making up for, but I've already done one. We had one class on Locke, sort of, and then I did a lecture on Locke, kind of introducing the main themes and everything, and recorded and posted that. So the theme of this lecture will be to continue Locke's understanding of the state of nature, especially the main question tonight, because it's Sunday night, is to explore Locke's understanding of property. Um, before we even begin, because we'll be finishing up with the death of Stalin in class on Monday, the 18th, tax dates, which I still have to do my taxes, which Locke, by the way, says is a proper power of government, because government has to be paid for, and therefore people who consent to government have to consent to taxes as long as they consent to them, which, remember, that becomes a theme in the American Revolution: no taxation without representation. It's all here in the second treatise. Um, but I want to read you two quotes that are apropos to our watching the death of Stalin, and the question that I asked you to think about in terms of Locke's view of the state of nature, which we'll develop a little bit more, but also what Locke would what Locke would think of Stalin. So this is from chapter 2 of the State of Nature, it's from paragraph 13. So let me share this with you. I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature. And by the way, we'll see. Locke, like Hobbes, does think that the state of nature is probably not a great place, although not to the same degree and not for the same reasons that Hobbes thinks so. Um, but we'll see what Locke thinks the inconveniences of the state of nature are, and why they lead to political society, and what political power and political society consists of. I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature, which must certainly be great when men are judges in their own case, since it is easy to be imagined that he who was so unjust as to do his brother an injury will scarce be so just as to condemn himself for it. But I shall desire those who make this objection to remember that absolute monarchs are but men, and if government is to be the remedy of those evils which necessarily follow from men being judges in their own causes, and the state of nature is not to be endured, I desire, and I think this is aimed right at Hobbes, I desire to know what kind of government that is, and how much better it is than the state of nature, where one man commanding a multitude has the liberty to judge in his own case, and may do to all his subjects whatever he pleases, without the least liberty to say one, to question or control those who execute his pleasure. And in whatsoever he doeth, whether led by reason, mistake, or passion, must be submitted to. Much better it is in the state of nature, wherein men are not bound to submit to the unjust will of another. And if he that judge amiss in his own or other case, he is answerable to it for the rest of mankind. And further on, in chapter 11, the extent of the legislative power. This is from paragraph 137. Absolute arbitrary power, or governing without settled standing laws, can neither of them consist, that is to say, be consistent with, the ends of society and government, which men would not quit the freedom of the state of nature for, and tie themselves up under, were it not to preserve their lives, liberties, and fortunes, and by stated rules of right and property to secure their peace and quiet. It cannot be supposed that they should intend, had they a power to do so, to give to any one or more an absolute arbitrary power over their persons and estates, and put a force into the magistrate's hands to execute his unlimited will arbitrarily upon them. This were to put themselves in a worse condition than the state of nature, wherein they had a liberty to defend their right against the injuries of others, and were on equal terms of force to maintain it, whether invaded by a single man or many in combination. Whereas by supposing that they have given themselves up to the absolute arbitrary will of a legislature, they have disarmed themselves and armed him to make a prey of them whenever he pleases. He, he being in a much worse condition, who is exposed to the arbitrary power of one man, who has the command of 100,000 men, than he that is exposed to the arbitrary will that his will, who is such a command, is better than that of men, though his force be 100,000 times stronger. And therefore, whatever form the Commonwealth is under, the ruling power ought to govern by declared and received laws, and not by extemporary decrees and undetermined resolutions. For then mankind will be in a far worse condition than in the start of nature, if they have armed one or a few men with the joint power of a multitude, to force them to obey at pleasure the exorbitant and unlimited degrees of their sudden thoughts or unrestrained, and till that moment unknown wills, without having any measures set down which may guide and justify their actions. For all the power the government has, being only for the good of society, as it ought to be, as it ought not to be arbitrary and at pleasure, so it ought to be exercised by established and promulgated laws, that both the people may know their duty and be safe and secure within the limits of the law, and the rulers too kept within their bounds, and not to be tempted by the power they have in their hands to employ it to such purposes and by such measures as they would not have known, and not by willingly. So Locke's, as we're going to see, I've already said in my first recorded lecture, that Locke reformulates Hobbesianism in three broad areas: a different state of nature, a milder state of nature, in which the primary activity of human beings is not killing each other in a desperate attempt to stay alive, where Hobbes says it's so chaotic that there's no ownership, there's no property, and it's so unsafe. Locke will give a different account of human beings in their natural state, in which the primary activity of a human being and the primary emotional structure of a human being. So I think, again, it's important to remember Locke is, I think, thinking that not only is he thought the premises of Hobbesianism more thoroughly philosophically, I think he's going to argue he's a better psychologist than Hobbes. Not, by the way, that Hobbes is utterly wrong about these things, and that when push comes to shove, that people will fight to preserve their lives, and they have a perfect right to do so, just like Hobbes says. But it's almost as if Locke is arguing that human beings, by their natural psychology and the way they operate under their natural conditions, and especially the original natural condition, is they're not busy killing or fighting each other; they're busy acquiring property. And that creates a different picture of human beings as a natural being, a milder, more rational picture. It will also explain, as I shall go on when we talk about property, some things that Locke thinks that Hobbes left unexplained. Like, if human beings had no society, how could they have formed language? Society must have come before language for language to develop. And you're going to see in Locke's understanding of that, it's property that is the key. It's property that turns sexuality into families, and families a stable sense of property. And you're going to see Locke will argue that without a common power over us, while it's likely that we will eventually come to blows, that's not our first impulses. Our first impulse is to get more, to acquire, to work for ourselves in the state of nature. And in some ways, what Locke is going to argue is, whereas Hobbes says you can't disobey the sovereign, because once the sovereign, you're back to the state of nature, and society is impossible. Locke is going to argue that society is possible among human beings. It's in their self-interest to do so. In what sense? They see, because once labor transforms the human consciousness and kind of makes them aware of nature, you're going to see property, labor, is the kind of source of the beginning of human consciousness. And once human communities stabilize and language forms, then it turns out society is possible not through coercion, but human beings will self-interestedly enter into society because they see they can augment their property through commerce and exchange. Now, this is a complicated story, and we'll pick this apart more. But the point here is that the state of nature that Locke is presenting, as I said, is a much milder place. Society is possible, and human beings are more rational. And and we'll speak about the content of a state of nature and what all those human beings busy doing, acquiring property in the state of nature doing. Now, again, in my prior lecture, I summarized the reformulation of Hobbesian teaching in three broad areas: a different state of nature, different human nature, a different account of political power. And in place of the single powerful sovereign who strikes terror, and this is where I think Locke will also claim to be a better political philosopher, a better philosopher of human psychology under political conditions. That it turns out that um, that the Hobbesian solution to the inconveniences of the state of nature to create an absolute sovereign whose power to terrorize compels obedience. There's a real problem with that. And the problem is this: that sovereign, and the frontispiece of the Hobbesian, the first printed edition of Hobbes' Leviathan, um, it has like the big picture of Charles made up of all the hundreds and thousands of people inside of him. The problem is that artificial sovereign is still a natural person, and therefore that sovereign that you've now expanded beyond all natural equalities, so that he has the power to compel obedience. That sovereign is a human being too, and therefore that's why it leads to the two pieces I just read, and to a different view of political power and sovereignty. Locke argues that when you give that much power to a human being, you're actually turning yourself into a slave. And you're going to see Hobbes says you do not have the power to turn yourself into a slave. Hobbes is not only the great philosopher of property, and the theme of human life is acquisition and comfort, um, but Hobbes is also the great philosophy of liberty. And in some ways, you're going to see it's Locke who gives the anti-slavery foundations of American life its principled stand. And I'll share with you a quote from a Lincoln speech during the Lincoln Douglas period, in which we'll see the pure Lockeanism of Lincoln. Um, but to go back to the second reformulation, instead of the absolute sovereign, Locke posits the rule of law. That what society supplies that nature doesn't supply isn't artificial power per se. Yes, that's necessary because it turns out human beings need power. But the main thing that a well constructed political power first provides is law, standing settled rules, because that's what rational people can understand. A law is a principle, a rule of reason, and therefore living under law as opposed to obedience to an absolute sovereign, which of course you can terrify a dog into obedience. But Locke thinks that political power has to be founded in the power to make laws. So the rule of law becomes the foundation, and you'll see the other elements of Hobbes's refounded political teaching are not just the rule of law, but the constitutional forms of government that keep the rule of law in place, especially the new doctrine of the separation of powers. Locke's not a full theorist of the separation of powers and checks and balances, although you can read that out of the second treatise. It's the American founders who actually build upon Lockeanism to create a unique kind of American constitutionalism in the written Constitution and in the reformulated doctrine of separation of powers, which we'll go over through in Locke in chapters 11, 12, and 13 of the second treatise. Just by way of history, once Lockeanism spreads to the continent and is embraced by, you could say, the next great continental political philosopher, which is Montesquieu. And in 1733, Montesquieu writes a tract called The Spirit of Laws, which actually provides the conceptual foundations of the Confederated Republic that kind of becomes the basis of the American Republic, but then also reformulates Locke's three powers of legislative, executive. We'll explore this, and federative. Why those three powers? Why three powers? Why those three powers? And what the federative power is. It's Montesquieu who reformulates the doctrine of separation of powers so that it becomes legislative, executive, and judicial for reasons that we'll explore. So there's no question that Locke and Montesquieu are the important teachers of the American founders. But rule of law, constitutional forms, separation of powers, and as you're going to see, this leads to the third reformulation of Hobbes's teaching, which is distinctive in Locke, and that is, remember, Hobbes says that once the sovereign is formed and you've authorized him, you can't disobey him. You can't disobey the sovereign. There is no right of resistance or revolution. This is the third great difference between Locke and Hobbes. In the last three chapters of Leviathan, of Second Treatise, sorry, um, Locke will present a theory of resistance and revolution that becomes immediately relevant to the generation and a half of Americans following Locke. Because it'd be easy to say that the way that Locke got into American life was um, Locke became very prominent after the publication of his major works, and because in some ways of the influence of the English Glorious Revolution in 1688, and the first and second treatise were published in 1689, 1688, 1689. And in fact, Locke is often considered to be the philosopher of the Glorious Revolution, but he's clearly the philosopher of the American Revolution through Montesquieu, because you could say that Locke's teaching, with some other great Republican teachers, such as David Hume and Algernon Sidney, um, crossed the ocean. And when the first American academies, Harvard and the College of William and Mary, of which I taught at, not in 1696 when it was founded, um, uh, but uh, but the Lockean corpus and teaching had become almost dogmatic by the time that the young Americans were in college and school in the middle 1700s. Um, uh, and you could say that Lockeanism, to follow the Cropsey article, had not only kind of drifted down, but crossed the ocean and became the popular philosophy of the American Revolution, aided by not only Thomas Jefferson, who drafted and wrote the Declaration and the Second Continental Congress, but by Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet in January of 1776, Common Sense, um, was a kind of a broad presentation of Lockean thought, and you could say was the publication event, aside from the broad trickling down effect, that actually spread Lockeanism as a popular philosophy to justify the American Revolution and their resistance against royal authority. Um, so again, to summarize, the reformulation of Hobbesianism is a different state of nature, milder and a more rational, less violent picture of human nature and human psychology, a different picture of sovereignty and political power grounded in the rule of law, constitutional forms, separation of powers, um, uh, and um, and then a third part, the reformulation. You could say what I put in my notes is a more rational populace. By that meaning, um, the reason that Hobbes thinks that you can't resist the sovereign is not because you're authorized his actions, but as you're going to see, for Locke, what you authorize is the rule of law and constitutional forms. And Locke will also give part of, you'll see in the chapters after the theory of separation of powers and legislative power, and chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, the subordination of the executive to the legislative. Um, Locke's more rational populace is armed with, first of all, his new theory of usurpation is when one constitutional office tries to take over the powers, which he calls usurpation, um, then in some ways Locke provides the populace with a series of signs or steps to identify when their government is on the way to tyranny. And once the populace perceives that their government has become tyrannical and destructive of their rights and property, then he arms them with a doctrine of resistance and ultimately revolution and a replacement of constitutional government. So that's Lockeanism in a broad stroke. Now, the reason I wanted to begin with those two quotes about absolute power and why tyranny is actually worse than the state of nature is it's not just because Locke argues that people, contrary to Hobbes, that people form political power just to live and stay alive and be safe. Again, Locke's going to argue that the natural activity of human being is acquiring property, which is to say laboring, that human beings can live peacefully with each other. Now, it's true that vision gets screwed up, and it leads to the inconveniences of the state of nature without a common power or judge over us, common laws, common power, common judge. And that's what politics will provide in order to provide not just more survival, but a comfortable and peaceful survival, in which each person is free to own, acquire, and keep the property that he or she owns. And by the way, in the chapter on paternal power, and I'm not going to make much of this in class, but on the chapter on political power, paternal power, and political power, Locke reveals, like Hobbes does, his proto-feminism. Um, and because the absolute power of a prince by some authors was derived from the right of fatherhood. And Locke reminds you in those two chapters, the chapter 6 on paternal power, chapter 7 on political power, that, doesn't the mother have a hand in it too? And in the same way that Hobbes, in chapter 22 of the Leviathan, had argued that men rule because that's how it's always been, and men kind of terrorized women to subordination, Locke argues that, in a sense, the greater strength of men seduced early societies into thinking, into forgetting the role of the female, and that the female is an equal partner. And by the way, the male's rule over female has to be through the consent. So the natural feminist inclination of modern principles, the equality and freedom of rights, is actually there in Hobbes, but in some ways is spelled out and becomes part of a kind of a broad before the 20th century feminist movements in Europe and America in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Um, uh, you could say that a kind of an American feminism based on the equal right of women to have access to ownership of themselves and property that they themselves own, which is a Lockean principle, had sort of taken popular root. So so anyway, let's oh, and the other reason I really wanted to read those passages about absolute power. Locke is a subtle psychologist. He's a materialist, by the way, and in some ways, uh, Locke's second treatise is a kind of a more accessible, perhaps if that's the right word, more commonsensical presentation of the foundations of modern thought than Hobbes is. But Locke wrote many other works too, just like Hobbes wrote many other works. But the Leviathan, in some ways, is a much more comprehensive presentation of Hobbesianism than the second treatise is of Lockeanism. And other works of Locke are just as powerful and influential in the wider philosophic world and in the political world. In particular, let me mention these in passing because I'm not asking you to read them in class, but the ideas are reflected in the second treatise. Is Locke's essay on human understanding, which he presents the materialist. It has the same kind of materialism that Hobbes and Descartes and probably all of the modern thinkers do. The only reality is the material universe, matter in motion. And to some degree, Locke is the author. Remember, every philosopher has his or her important code words and thoughts. The most important watch phrase or whatever, or famous sage of Locke is, we'll see in the second treatise, is that a day labor in England is better clothed and fed and housed than a king in America. That's a kind of a summary of Locke's proto-capitalism, that a society of rule of law and which guarantees private ownership and guarantees people the right to acquire property and exchange it under the conditions of the free market leads to an abundance in society, which is ultimately Locke's justification for the inequality that money introduces. Because for us to understand Locke's doctrine of the state of nature, we have to understand property, labor, and his understanding of liberty. But then also, we have to see what it is that leads to the creation of society. One of the things I said in my first lecture, and this is a critical thing we'll see unfold in Locke um, and also in Rousseau, whereas Hobbes is casual about the historical existence of something called the general state of nature that, that brought humanity from mere nature into politics, political society, and society in general. Locke begins to take quite seriously the notion of an original state of nature. Locke, like Hobbes, says the state of nature is real and exists whenever there is not common law or common power over us. Then we're back in the state of nature, sovereigns with each other, and human beings beyond the reach of the law. So, in that sense, Locke and Hobbes are identical. There is a real state of nature. It exists now and here whenever there is no common power over human beings, or in Locke's case, a common set of laws and common executive power and judicial power. But because of the gaps in Hobbes's account of these things, Locke takes seriously and tries to explain how human beings really did move from a state of animality and non-rationality through a gradual set of what you might call archaeological or paleobiological, actually evolutionary rise to society. This, by the way, which the beginnings of which are in Locke, becomes a critical and major theme that you will see in Rousseau in the second discourse on the origin of inequality, and in subsequent thinkers in Kant and Hegel, and especially Marx, and even Nietzsche. The idea that in order to understand human nature as it exists now, as we see it and live it right now, you actually have to reconstruct historically the transition from an historical and general primitive state of nature in which human characteristics gradually emerge. Now, the key in the Lockean account of that is, of course, property. It's the acquisition and change in the nature and sophistication of property that actually stabilizes human life, leads to society, and ultimately the possibility of a rational and limited civil government under the rule of law and constitutional forms. Note about absolute power. It's not just that Locke says that absolute power is worse than the state of nature, because once you give absolute power to a single human being, you're actually uh, putting yourself in literally greater danger than you would be in the state of nature. Well, at least it's mano a mano. It's relatively equal. The natural equality of human beings and the limits on human property and power kind of make it at least a fair shot. But once you expand the power of a single human being and give that person absolute power, the rule of personal will, you're going to see Locke really is a philosopher not only of liberty and property and law, but also of reason. Hobbes believes that one great advantage of civilized human beings over animals is reason. Unlike Aristotle and the ancients, who thought that reason was grounded in our natures, Locke, like all the moderns, argues that no reason, like language, society, and all these things were acquired along the way. They are artificial and not part of our natural constitution. Having said so, Locke recognizes it's better for human beings to live by reason. Now, that will support his notion of the rule of law. So, what's the matter with absolute power? Because it turns a single human being who can be moved by passion and will and self interest, and in fact, all of us are, from into monsters, which then become beasts to the rest of us. And because we have in fact enslaved ourselves to their absolute power, we deform our own psychologies, and therefore we cease to be rational and free beings in the presence of an absolute tyrant. My guess is you will see evidence of that, and have seen evidence of it in the death of Stalin. So let's proceed to Locke's understanding of the state of nature and pick it apart and see the central role of property. The great textual presentation of Locke's theory of properties, chapter 5. But it is worth noting, before you build up to that, some different takes on the state of nature that he adds in the earlier chapters. Locke says that that by nature you can't alienate your right to be alive. He's like Hobbes in that respect. Nature puts the right to life in you because nature creates your life and creates your needs, and therefore you are entitled by nature to pursue your needs. Now, Locke's argument, as we'll see in chapter 5, is the primary response of the human condition to the natural condition is labor, which means both the origin of private property in the natural impulse to expand one's body's energy over external objects, and, which is equally true, not only the act of labor generates property, but that is to say ownership, which is rooted in the real natural person of the human being, as we'll see, but it also generates value. I mentioned in class that Locke is one of the great originators, in fact, the originator of what's called the labor theory of value. And what generates value in objects, products, etc., becomes a great theme in political economy over the next couple of centuries, and in fact becomes the foundation of Marxism. As we'll see in the Communist Manifesto, Marx argues that all value, all real objective scientific value, comes from the amount of labor in something, but he got that concept from Locke. So interestingly, I've called Locke a proto-capitalist, and because in some ways, core centrality of private property, limited government, the rule of law is sort of like what liberal constitutional capitalist democracy looks like in the West. But there is a certain sense in which Locke is also the founder of the major other social, political, and cultural alternative in modernity, which is the radical left. culminating in Marxism and to some degree existentialism, as we'll see. But anyway, it's worth noting that Locke's state of nature is not chaos. Locke argues that there are laws of nature, which, by the way, like Spinoza and to some degree, like other philosophers at this time, do see in like the regular, like gravity, like Newton, who, by the way, was writing the Principia Mathematica, the Great Revolution in modern physics, just about the same time that Locke was writing the second treatise. Influenced, of course, by Descartes, Galileo, etc. And that nature moved in regular motion, and that motion could be known scientifically by human beings. Locke's still in that camp, by the way, and so in some ways, for Locke, whereas Hobbes's law of nature was kind of a second thought to his own understanding of right. Remember, in chapter 14 of Leviathan, Hobbes says the right of nature is the natural freedom you have to do anything that you judge you need to do in order to stay alive. It's not to do whatever you want. It's to do whatever you need to do to stay alive. Remember, those aren't identical things, and you should remember that. Locke is in the same camp. Locke doesn't think that in the state of nature you're free to do anything, but rather you're only free to work for your own good, to acquire property, and to defend and hold on to it. So, in some ways, for Locke, there is a law of nature in the state of nature, and that is you have the right to work hard to acquire property to preserve yourself. And when you're not doing that, it's not a bad idea to help other people. But the main thing is to live in peace and keep what you own. And if somebody tries to steal from you, so in Locke's state of nature, there are two things that identify him as a philosopher of liberty, which is to say non-slavery, and a philosopher of reason and law. Locke says that what defines the state of nature is everyone's living under the law of nature, which is you work, you get to acquire what you need and keep what you own, and you get to defend what you own. Now, that's why Locke has two interesting things in the about his state of nature. One, he says that strictly speaking, what defines the state of nature is everyone's living under a law, the law of nature. Of course, it's not expressed, it's not formulated like civil law or positive laws, which is one of the great advantages of civil society, because actually you have written laws that stand as general principles. In the state of nature, the law of nature is a kind of broad awareness that that you get to keep whatever you work for, and then and here are the two aspects that really make Lockeanism unique and lead to, in some ways, American political principles. One is you can't enslave yourself. Remember, Hobbes says your right to stay alive means you can do anything to stay alive, including giving somebody complete power over you. If that's what leads to your survival, you have the right to do that. Locke really disagrees with that. He says, no, you don't. And that's why the triad of rights, life, liberty, property, which formulate and resonate through American life and exist in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution and in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and becomes in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We can talk about that, but this is not an American political theory class. It's a modern political philosophy class. But there's a reason why liberty comes right after life. Now you can say Hobbes does the same thing. Life comes in and equality of human beings to life and everything comes in chapter 13 of Leviathan. The equal right to preserve your life comes in. But Hobbes is so insistent upon the violence of the state of nature that, again, your right to life includes the right to alienate your own liberty completely to another human being. And indeed, that's what Hobbes's political solution is. For Locke, no, you don't. You can't. You don't have the right to alienate your natural equal liberty, because to enslave yourself to another person, to give yourself over to another human being, means that human being has complete control over you and can any minute take your life. So for Locke really is a philosopher of liberty. You can't alienate your life. You can't alienate your liberty, because to alienate your life to another human being, even to another single human being, ultimately means the destruction of your right to life. So for Locke, there is a natural bond between the right to life and the right to liberty. You can't give up liberty to save your life. It's inconsistent. It's irrational. Moreover, Locke says, in what really defines the state of nature, this is in chapters 2 and 3 and 4, on the state of war, the state of nature and the state of war, etc., and slavery, is uh, the real law of nature says you get to keep what you own. If somebody comes to steal your property, therefore, Locke says you have the right. Oh, let me back up. So, in the state of nature, there's the common law of nature, which says you get to work for and keep what you want and defend your own life. To be sure, there is a Hobbesianism under this, but ultimately, um, uh, your property is your life, and that to some degree, if somebody comes to steal your property, they are posing as much a threat to your natural right to life as taking away your liberty. So so this kind of jives with Hobbes's Locke's interesting notion that what defines our state of nature is that every human being in the state of nature possesses the executive power to enforce the law of nature. So it's not the chaos and violence that Hobbes imagined in our natural condition, or even when we live without a sovereign. The reason we can live without a sovereign is because our first business is to work hard to acquire property and to keep what we own. It turns out that once you kind of direct human beings in that energy, they're not killing each other all the time, nor do they need to kill each other all the time. They only need to kill each other when somebody goes to take your property. And when somebody goes to so that's why that's why Locke says, if somebody comes to steal your property, you have the right to kill him, because if he's going to come to steal your property, there's no evidence that he won't stop at your property or your liberty, that person is also ready to take your life. And therefore, Locke theorizes that as you have the right. So in the state of nature, when there's no common power over you, you are nature's executive power over the your own life that the law of nature allows you to have. So Locke already imagines in human beings' natural condition a kind of a separation of powers. Nature provides the law. What nature doesn't provide is a common executive over human beings. Human beings are thrown back on their own individual power to execute the law of nature, which means what? To preserve their own property. And not only does Locke say you have the right to kill a thief who comes to take your property, if you see a thief trying to steal someone else's property, Locke says, and he kind of wants to kind of couch this in almost Christian love terms, love your neighbor as yourself. But no, the reason you have the right to kill a thief who's going to take somebody else's property is it's clear that the thief or the one who wants to enslave you, both the master, the absolute master, or the thief, means to deny the law of nature that entitles you to your life, your liberty, and your property. And in the same way that a cop in civil society has the right to exercise artificial executive power to arrest somebody who violates the laws of political society, Locke says in the state of nature, we have the right to execute the law of nature, which is to say, not only to defend yourself, but to kill anybody who doesn't respect another person's life, freedom, or property. So, with that in mind, um, let's turn then to Locke's central concept that defines his state of nature, and that's and human identity in general, and provides a different psychology, one more consistent with a legal, rational, and limited political authority, and that is property. So Locke starts with what he thinks is the critical fact of nature. You are the natural owner of your body. And whereas and that means that you own all the processes and all the energy of your body. And probably that's a concept that most people, probably even if they don't think of themselves as Lockeans today, probably more or less kind of believe that. Where Hobbes says in the state of nature, you're your own little sovereign, the way that Locke reconfigures your natural sovereignty over yourself is you are the owner of your own body. You own your body. Now, of course, that means there's the rest of nature. Now, Locke says, by the way, nature as nature, before transformed by anything outside of natural processes, belongs to everybody. So all the world's resources belong to all human beings, and that's why Hobbes says, by the way, or Locke says that human beings are not necessarily killing each other all the time in the original primitive state of nature, because there were so few human beings and the earth was so vast. And by the way, there is one critical aspect of the law of nature as Locke conceives it that we'll see that will be consequent of property, and that is the natural equality of human beings isn't just in the fact like that we're members of the same species, have basically the same powers, which is kind of a Lockean, Hobbesian Lockean notion. As Hobbes says in chapter 13 of Leviathan, I find men so equal in body and mind. Locke really believes in the species equality of the human beings, even though some are stronger, etc. But you're going to see there is another dimension to natural equality for Locke that derives from the nature of natural property. So in chapter 5, especially, this is in paragraphs 27, a very rich paragraph, and that what happens in the state of nature when you labor is you mix the energy of your body, which stems from your natural needs, over an external object. And so for Locke, if there's an apple tree and there are apples on the ground or on the tree, at what point does the common ownership of all natural resources becomes your property? And Locke would say the moment that you reach out and mix the energy of your body in with that thing. So appropriation, privatization begins the moment where you take some of the common resources that belong to all human beings in common. The moment you take it out of that common stock by applying the energy of your body, and you could say, wait a minute, does that mean like picking an apple up off the ground is what makes it yours? And Locke would say yes. But of course, before you do that, that apple belongs to you and every other human being equally and commonly. It's your extending your body like an external boundary over an external object by mixing your body's energy into it, that literally creates the natural basis of you owning it. And that's what property is. It's when the natural human being extends the energy of his body, and therefore, because you own your body, and when you extend that body over external things, the external property becomes literally an extension of your body. It is as much yours by nature as your own body is yours. Now, the second thing that Locke argues that happens when you do that is you add value. And as chapter 5 unfolds, and the steps that lead up to the creation of the state of civil society, this is why this is the labor theory of value. Because for Locke, when that apple lies there, when that nut lies underneath a walnut tree or whatever, the land, as long as it's common to every human being, which is to say no human being has mixed his or her bodily energy into it, it has only what you could say it has potential value. But it's the mixture of human labor into it that also then simultaneously, the moment that it creates private property, it also creates and adds value to it. Because yes, the apple is of no value when it's lying there on the ground, but the moment a human being extends his or her hand and picks it up, it becomes useful. Now, Locke really runs with this concept and says this is true of all human effort. That the great resources of nature have almost no value. By the end of chapter 5, he's reduced the amount that nature provides not only by 1 in 10, but 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. And of course, what he's going to say, and this is what leads to his famous statement that a day laborer in England is wealthier, better off than the richest king in America, because it's the transformation of natural potential into useful human commodities, not only to yourself. Like if you, for instance, you pick a bushel of apples, then your energy has created that bushel of apples, and it becomes useful to you. Now, you're going to see that it also becomes potentially useful to other human beings too. And by the way, this is why Locke argues that property is not only the picture of a more peaceful human being, that what nature makes us doing with most of our energies most of the time isn't killing each other to stay alive. It's working hard to get the things we need individually. or in the primitive family, etc. But once property, in other words, stabilizes sexuality and turns it for the self-interest of mother and father into a family unit. Remember, property is the mother of everything in Locke, not sexuality. And we're going to see Rousseau will even give an even more radical account of sexuality and the dependence of child on mother. But um, but for Locke, uh, you have the right to mix your body's energy and to extend your property over whatever you need to generate your needs. And in doing so, you actually create objects of value to human beings. So um, uh, this leads to Locke's interesting, you could say, not a third law, but the critical law of nature that is another form of human equality. So you can acquire as much as you need to keep yourself alive. You have the right to as much property as you need to stay alive by nature. But, and this is where the idea of a historical state of nature versus the eventual origins of civil society come in. Because, um, uh, uh, and by the way, on the question of the source of value, look at chapters 27. I'm sorry, not chapters, paragraphs 27, 37, 40, 31, and 41. That's the paragraph, by the way, 41, that has the king of a large and fruitful territory there in America feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day labor in England. That's the actual quote. That's Locke. By the way, I mentioned the other works of Locke, which I forget to elaborate. I talked about the essay on human understanding, in which Locke lays out the same material psychology that Hobbes does in chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Leviathan. And in doing so, by the way, one of Locke. One of Locke's other great phrases from the essay on human understanding is that the human mind and brain is what he calls a tabula rasa, an empty chart, an empty slate. And that's so Locke argues that almost all of human identity comes from the conditions of human life. Um, Almost like a pre-sentiment of Darwinism, that material evolution is what drives not only all of biological development but human development into ultimately civilization, more complex property, and this will become a key element of Marxism, as you're going to see. That's my Alexa phone in the background, and I probably just activated her accidentally by that. Um, But to go back to the other work that Locke is famous for, in addition to the Secretaries of Government and the essay Humanization, is of course a letter concerning toleration. Locke is the great architecture of the separation of church and state and the idea of religious toleration as a necessary form of constitutional government. I should just mention that. But anyway, to get back to chapter 5 and the second treatise. So um, the so the natural law that confirms human equality and property is, Locke argues, you have a right by nature to acquire as much as you need, but only as much as you can use. Locke argues that the natural limit on how much you can acquire is you can't waste resources. So, on one level, whereas it might make sense for you to pile up a bushel of apples, you don't have a right to pile up thousands of apples because you can't use them. They're going to rot. And you're acquiring them and turning them into your property, which you've actually done is stolen from the rest of humanity because you can't possibly use them. So there really is, in addition to the species equality of body and mind that Hobbes talks about, Locke really argues that property also has a kind of a natural equality to it. And you're going to see that in some ways. It's this limit, it's this different kinds of property which waste and rot at different times. Locke really thinks that it's this awareness of acquiring different kinds of property that ultimately leads to the development of the human mind. You can see different relationships in nature, and ultimately what leads to trade and commerce, because you can see that somebody has a bushel of nuts and you have a bushel of apples, and that nuts don't spoil. And Locke actually goes through different kinds of property. And therefore, this is why I believe that Locke thinks that's the evolution of property, the specific kinds and sophistication of property that ultimately leads to the development of human reason. And once stable units form, when property transforms sex into families and language forms, leads to a stable and possible society. Now, um, uh, so that's the milder, more rational, and property-oriented psychology, I think, that Locke sees, that corrects Hobbes's starker, darker, and inaccurate view of human nature. Now, the glitch in all this, and if you're looking at the notes, this is on page the second page of the reform notes under Roman numeral 3A. I'm still developing, is what's the hitch? It turns out that property and commerce exchanges more different kind, and therefore kind of a kind of complex society can evolve without the coercion of government, by the way, but because there's this natural equality that limits how much each people can own. What's the devil in the haystack, or whatever the image is? And you're going to see the key to Locke's understanding of what leads to our natural condition to the necessity of civil government is the invention of money. Now, money has this very complex role in Locke's philosophy, because on the one hand, money, once a medium of exchange exists, then you can actually acquire more than you need. And it's money severing the connection between want and need, or acquisition and natural need, which destroys the original natural equality of the human race. That leads to the necessity ultimately of civil laws, because, of course, with money you can have inequality of property. And it's the inequality of property that leads to the struggle between human beings, etc. And as you're going to see, it's that, but it turns out that well, does that mean, now, by the way, this is going to be an important difference between Rousseau and Locke, because Locke thinks that once money, complete artificial thing that only exists by human beings agreeing to give that money the value it does, but because it has no basis in natural value, money also then severs, as I said earlier, human life from its natural equal foundations. Money is both a devil and an angel at the same time, because it's money that will then lead to eventually the thousand scale expansion in the nature of value in a product, and lead to the gradual evolution of commodious and more developed property as society evolves. So, in some ways, the further we get away from natural equality of property, the better off we are as a species, because the more comfortable and complex our lives become. But on the other hand, it also leads to inequality and struggle over property, and that's what leads to the necessity of civil society. We need society to protect our property against the potential stealing of others, whether it's the rich against the poor against each other. So money is the great spoiler of human innocence, but it's also the great unleasher of human ingenuity and material progress. So, as we're going to see in the next lecture, when we talk about Locke's politics, we'll see that that's, for Locke, that's why people form civil society, to save their lives, because, of course, but their property becomes equivalent to their lives. But Locke says the great end of political power, which is different from paternal power, and that's what he thinks the great problem with primitive society was. People mistook, and you'll see that this is his version of chapter 11 of Hobbes' Leviathan. How did we get from natural simplicity and equality to the mess we have today with tyranny and everything like that? Because it turns out the human race was simpler in its original stage, and they mistook paternal power, which, by the way, is not absolute power over children, but only the right to govern them while they are naturally unequal to their parents. You're going to see it's a conditional right. And the woman's right is just as equal as the man's right in chapter 6 and 7. But that leads to the necessity of political power, which is what? Not the common power over everyone per se, but once equalities and differences of property exist, we need law. Law to stabilize the definition of property and ownership, but we also need executive power to enforce the laws. So Locke says the great purpose for people entering into political society is to create laws in government to protect their property and to lead to a more comfortable and peaceful life.